Final Fantasy is without question Square Enix's biggest franchise. It is their flagship IP, and so sales figures surrounding this franchise will absolutely matter for the company. They want to see Final Fantasy grow as a brand. They are hoping that every new game exceeds in sales from the previous one, so that the franchise can continue to grow for long-term prospects for what is such an iconic series in the landscape of gaming. Now, there's been some debate as to how well Final Fantasy 16 was going to sell and is selling currently. Critical reception-wise, the game's doing really well. I mean, generally, it's been received really positively among both critics and players alike. But there were early indications that Square Enix might be worried about how well this game is going to sell. So right here is Imran Khan's Patreon. And scrolling down, you'll find this excerpt where he said that I had heard recently that Square Enix is panicking slightly over Final Fantasy 16 pre-order numbers, which are tracking behind Final Fantasy 15, even accounting for the lesser number of launching platforms. Now, this was before the game's launch. This was even before the Final Fantasy 16 demo came out. That demo impressed a lot of people, and I think a lot of people pre-ordered the game because of that demo. And eventually, Final Fantasy 16, the Twitter page here and on social media was announced that the game had sold and shipped and digitally sold 3 million copies of Final Fantasy 16 on PlayStation 5, which is a pretty impressive sales figure when you consider that this is not a multi-platform game. It is just a PS5 exclusive. So these are pretty impressive figures overall, given the circumstances. We're talking about an install base of roughly 40 million PlayStation 5 users, and for 3 million Final Fantasy 15 copies to be sold among this player base, that's not bad at all. And if we look at how this game sales compare to other titles, especially those PlayStation exclusives like God of War and Last of Us and Final Fantasy VII Remake and Spider-Man, some of these which were cross-generation, you can see that Final Fantasy 16, holds up. It is in the top 10 list, and it is the fastest-selling PlayStation 5 exclusive ever, meaning no cross-gen, just PlayStation 5. So far so good, right? While there are other analysts who are suggesting that Final Fantasy 16 sales might not be going according to Square Enix's plans, it's one thing to just look at raw numbers. It's another thing to look at what Square Enix was expecting, especially when it comes to the homeland of Japan, where sales tumbled quite a bit. This is Takahashi Mochizuki's analysis of this situation. He tweeted out, as expected, Final Fantasy 16 second week sales tumbled in Japan. It will be difficult to sell more without a deep price cut, Toyo Securities Yasuda says. Note that Takahashi Mochizuki is specifically looking at Japan, where a significant portion of Final Fantasy sales happen. He further commented by saying that some say Final Fantasy 16's weak sales are due to elements out of Square Enix's control. No, it wasn't. It was Square Enix that decided to launch the game on PS5 only on June 22nd at $70. No one else is. So he's adamant that if you look at raw numbers, that Final Fantasy 16 sales just aren't as good as they could be, with choices like PS5 exclusivity and launching during the busy period of June being contributing factors. And he provided figures for what physical sales look like for the game in Japan. Recent Final Fantasy sales in Japan, launch week to second week, excluding download sales, so again, physical only. So there's a comparison. Final Fantasy 16 in 2023, 336,027 units sold in the first week, and then in the second week, that dropped to 37,763 units. Physical units again, but it's more about looking at the percentage of drop when it comes to sales, and that likely isn't going to be too far off for digital sales either. Now, here's the thing. If you look at the drop-off from first week to second week sales of other major Final Fantasy releases like the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy 15, in terms of percentage, it's in line with what Final Fantasy 16 is showing here. The second week was about 10% of the sales that the first week was across the board for all three of these games. Now, there's something to consider about Japan specifically. Xbox does not sell in Japan. Xbox is almost like a null factor. It's almost something you don't take into consideration when it comes to something like Final Fantasy 15, which did launch multi-platform on Xbox and PlayStation. But if you look at just Japan specifically, you might as well not count Xbox sales because they're so minimal that it might as well not contribute to these figures. So if you look at it from the perspective of PS4 versus PS5 sales, Final Fantasy 16 sold about half of what Final Fantasy 15 did, But in terms of PS4 versus PS5 numbers during their respective launches, we're not talking about a 50% difference in console numbers. In Japan, PS5 numbers at the time of Final Fantasy XVI's launch are around 10% behind PlayStation 4 at the time of Final Fantasy XV's launch, and yet Final Fantasy XVI sales in Japan are half that of Final Fantasy XV, despite the 10% difference in the install base of PS4 versus PS5. So while internationally the game has sold 3 million units, in Japan, things are a little rough. You can tell that Final Fantasy XV's shift in style to something more action-oriented with RPG elements taking a backseat did have an impact on Japanese players' perception of the game and whether it's a game that appealed to them. It might have isolated some, fans and players who are expecting Final Fantasy to be more of that, traditional RPG. I think Square Enix was hoping that in Japan, numbers would be comparable enough to Final Fantasy 15 that sales across the board would exceed a little more than 3 million, a couple 100,000 more copies beyond that. But sales are just proving to be weaker on the Japan side of things, even if overall, when you consider the circumstances, the exclusivity of Final Fantasy 16, 3 million units is pretty freaking good. You know what else is pretty freaking good? The sponsor of today's video, Skillshare, a platform dedicated to forging a community of experts and learners. As a content creator, voice actor, and artist with myriad pursuits, the ability to quickly access useful classes to accelerate my proficiency with certain key skills is really important to me, and Skillshare has been a really convenient hub for me to absorb that type of knowledge. For example, I've wanted to expand my expertise with creative digital programs like Adobe Photoshop and After Effects, get better at vocal techniques like singing, and even learn instruments like the guitar, and there's so many great classes that are readily accessible here for these disciplines. There seems to be a class for just about anyone and anything, and the video classes I've discovered have all been pretty useful and have genuinely enhanced my progress in developing my desired skills. Beyond that, Skillshare also features classes that help optimize general aspects of your career, including classes that guide you on how to find confidence in your creativity, how to become more productive and better at time management, or how to start a business. It's a genuinely useful library of knowledge and insight that could develop your skills and help propel your career no matter what your goals and aspirations are. And by using my link, the first 1,000 people to join will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare that will allow you to give it a test drive. You'll find my link in the description box and comment section below if you want to take advantage of this offer. Now, zooming out and looking at the international picture of Final Fantasy XVI sales, this is William R. Aguilar who posted this whole analysis that he did. He broke this down in a way that, does paint a picture when it comes to Final Fantasy XV's trend and how, when you look at things internationally, not just the Japanese market, it's doing about as well, if not better, than Final Fantasy XV. So he broke it down as follows. The sales of Final Fantasy XV were 80% on PlayStation 4, 11% on PC, and 9% on Xbox One. In its first week, FF15 sold 5 million copies worldwide. Final Fantasy XV did eventually sell 10 million copies, but that took 6 years for it to happen. We'll see how long it takes for Final Fantasy XVI to reach those sales figures. I imagine that once FF16's timed exclusivity ends and it comes out on other platforms like PC and Xbox, that'll accelerate FF16's ability to reach that coveted 10 million units sold mark. Whether at a faster rate than Final Fantasy XV, well, that remains to be seen. But Final Fantasy XVI, being an exclusive title to PlayStation 5, sold 3 million units in 1 week. And so when you look at the overall install base of those respective games, again, outside of Japan where Xbox does play a factor, now we're looking at a situation where if you combine the total install base of PlayStation 4 users and Xbox One users worldwide and just how many more players had access to Final Fantasy 15 and compare that to just how significantly fewer PlayStation 5s are out there at the time of Final Fantasy 16's launch, then suddenly Final Fantasy 16's international sales start to look pretty decent. In a follow-up addendum tweet, William R. Aguilar broke things down as follows. So for Final Fantasy 15, 80% of the 5 million units that were sold on the first week were sold on PlayStation 5. So that's 4 million units sold on PlayStation 4 and its install base at the time. PS4 sold after Black Friday was 53 million units, which is significantly higher than the 39 million or the roughly 40 million PlayStation 5's install base right now. So when it comes to like attach rate of the number of consoles versus how many people who own that console bought the game, 7.5% of the PlayStation 4 install base bought Final Fantasy 15, whereas roughly 7.7% of the PlayStation 5 install base bought Final Fantasy 16. So when you look at it in that perspective, zoom out of Japan and look at how overall sales are doing, Final Fantasy 16 is tracking pretty well overall, though if Japan had performed roughly as well as Final Fantasy 15 did, sales could have been even greater. And there are plenty of other comparisons that are being made to highlight that Final Fantasy 16 selling 3 million copies in the first week as a PlayStation 5 exclusive is pretty impressive. Here's Derek, who said that Modern Warfare 2 sold 4.4 million copies in its first week on PlayStation alone, but this includes PS4 and PS5 sales. This was a cross-gen title, and Final Fantasy 16 got pretty decently close to that with just PlayStation 5 exclusivity sales. Others are saying that the perspective seems to be skewed when it comes to Final Fantasy 16 sales, that people seem to be much more strict with Final Fantasy 16 sales figures and quicker to call it a flop compared to other games when you consider that Street Fighter 6, which was reviewed very well and which many players are partaking in, has sold over 2 million copies within its first week. Final Fantasy 16 managed to sell 3 million copies within its first week. And keep in mind that Street Fighter 6 is multi-platform. It did come out on Xbox, PlayStation, and PC. Final Fantasy 16 came out just on PlayStation 5, and it outsold Street Fighter by, a million. All things said and done, things could be worse for Final Fantasy 16. Now, going back to the Japanese side of things, here is Genki, who addressed the situation in Japan, tweeting that Final Fantasy 16 sales in Japan are weaker than Final Fantasy 15 due to the current state of the PS market in Japan and the game catering more to Western audiences, the more action-oriented combat and aspects of, the setting and the vibe and the more Game of Thrones-y aspect to it. Maybe that stuff just alienated some users, some players, some fans in Japan. I think it's safe to say that in Japan, these are very tough results, and that Final Fantasy 16 did leave some consumers behind. It's too far from the past Final Fantasy. The identity of it just wasn't something that maybe appealed to Japanese audiences as much. But 3 million units sold worldwide for a PS5 exclusive is not weak sales overall, and this is the stance that I agree with. Things could have been better in Japan, but with all things said and done, I don't know how you can call 3 million units as a PlayStation 5 exclusive sold within the first week a flop. Now, it's one thing to look at raw numbers, and it's another thing to look at what Square Enix expected. Just because these are good numbers when you consider, the circumstances of Final Fantasy 16 and the exclusivity and all those things, doesn't mean necessarily that it reached Square Enix's expectations for how much money this game needed to make back its production costs, make back its marketing costs, and to meet certain financial quotas that they were hoping to meet before their next financial briefing. That's really what defines how successful this game is, in the eyes of Square Enix. It's worth noting that Square Enix does have a track record of setting sales expectations way too high and just being unrealistic with that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if this is a similar scenario where even if these numbers are actually pretty good, they set their goals so high and the budget got so bloated that even if Final Fantasy 16 does impressive numbers, unless it becomes a Tears of the Kingdom level or Elden Ring level type of mega hit, it's not going to make Square Enix the money that they would have liked this game to make, given the investment of time and manpower and resources. And Square Enix specifically, and the executives, they are looking at Final Fantasy 16 as a potential, not necessarily flop, but not a resounding success that they were hoping Final Fantasy 16 would be with its change in direction. There have been situations in the past where a game was a sales success, but a corporate flop, if you know my meaning. And so I guess time will tell how Square Enix presents the circumstances, whether in their next financial briefing they'll say, this exceeded our expectations or this met our expectations and we're in a really good place and we're happy with this. Or if they'll end up saying, oof, man, we were hoping that we could recoup more of the costs. We were hoping for more of a profit margin and more revenue than what yielded. In Japan, the game didn't perform as well. How much of an impact did that have on the game meeting the corporate sales expectations and quotas? Those are the questions that we still don't have answers to, and that's ultimately what will define if the people who made this game, the company that invested in making this product, deemed this a successful product. So we'll see how that pans out. Only time will tell. Square Enix will have to tell their investors at one point just, what their perspective is on all of this. Until then, though, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on Final Fantasy XVI selling 3 million units overall internationally within its first week of being released exclusively on PlayStation 5, and then the data with Japan, and whether you think Square Enix will ultimately be happy with the current results, or whether you think Square Enix will have set the expectations too high and that they'll ultimately share disappointing results, or will say that the results were disappointing based on their expectations. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.